Hello, guys, and welcome to my 7 round mock draft for the New York Jets. As we all know, this team very interesting, given that they have a new head coach, obviously, the pieces from last year gone, Adams, Rodgers, signing Justin Fields, and, some other, I wouldn't say significant, but then I would also say it's significant that they released some cap penalties, including CJ Mosley, which I think it was interesting to me, to say the least, that they got rid of this guy. We're going to go look over, who they've recently signed besides Fields, obviously. We have Fields and then some other guys who are like backups. I do expect that this team will be in the hunt for a tight end, a wide receiver, O lineman. I don't think they'll draft a QB unless it's crazy late and they really like someone, but I don't see that really either, to be honest with you. In terms of defense, you still have a very solid, defensive core, in my opinion. I think that Aaron Glenn will be having these guys playing very, very well. I think that, maybe we'll see a resurgence from Sauce Gardner in the sense that he's a guy to me that like could improve on his tackling and could be that kind of every down difference maker, because as we all know, one of the worst cornerbacks in terms of tackling, at least, who is a bona fide, piece in the coverage game. And then it's like signing Andre Cisco. I think that's huge. I don't think Jacksonville was using him correctly. Losing, DJ Reed, obviously. And then it's like you have Michael Carter, who's been off and on, to be honest with you. And then you bring in Brandon Stevens from Baltimore, which I think is solid. I think he can bring kind of that hard-nosed grittiness, from Baltimore here, and kind of advise some of these other guys and be that veteran presence in the locker room. But without further ado, let's get to the draft. So up at number 7, we do have some interesting picks, I guess, at the top. Cam Ward, Saunders, and then Abdul Carter. And then Ashton Ginty to the Patriots. Not bad. Mason Graham, defensive interior. Travis Hunter. So a lot of good talent still, and I've been doing this a lot, but I honestly think that, like, you look at the Jets, you have a guy like Garrett Wilson who's not the biggest dude, in the world, or that sort of thing. It's like you kind of want a bigger target for Fields. I'm going to draft McMillan. I think he does go top 10. It's surprising to me, I guess, that at his pro day, the only GM there was Gutekunst of the Packers. I think that that's just going to go and show that it's going to show to me that you've got, teams that maybe think he's going to go a lot earlier, or maybe they think that he's just going to be a bust prospect. But if he makes it, past, pick 15, I'm going to be kind of shocked. It's like if he makes it to 23, my Packers pick him, I'll be happy. That we have a really big bodied guy that it's like is going to win one-on-ones. But moving on to pick number 42, another player I feel like is kind of falling deep. I think Demetrius Knight Jr., the linebacker, he obviously, I've mocked him to several different teams, but it's like one of the things that really was lacking last year. And I think because of poor tackling, I think because of scheme, I think because of just the disarray of the team was their run defense, which is just bizarre. You look at the guys that they have on this team, and it's like, including Mosley, it's just like, Quincy Williams, Quinnen Williams, this speedster, obviously you had, besides Jamin Sherwood, you had Mosley, And it's just like, to me, obviously they play a lot of nickel and that sort of thing, but it's like, I don't know how much it'll be when Aaron Glenn is on the field. I think they're good enough, if coached correctly, to have just two corners and play a zone concept. Even though I think that Aaron Glenn likes to play a lot of man, I think that he's going to realize that he can't just do that, that it really kind of grinds players into the ground, doing that like the Lions did last year. But, looking at Demetrius Knight, maybe they're eyeballing, maybe they're not. It seems like kind of a waste to not take him here if he falls all the way to 42. And then we get to round 3. Looking at defensive interior here as a need, I think it's kind of funny. As we all know, Quinnen Williams is, really good. And, Derek Nnadi, who they signed from, Kansas City, obviously, you're bringing in a couple of guys, a couple of unprovens. Maybe you do want to bona fide alongside Quinnen Williams, but I do think Derek Nnadi, was a good run stuffer. So I'm not really looking at the defensive interior guys that are right here. I'm kind of looking at, the tackles and that sort of thing. Trapilo, let's see here. Good pass block, good gap. And Truset, very, very good. And it's like he played at right tackle. So, the last couple of years, but also played left tackle, where it definitely was his worst year. He was way more consistent on right tackle and that sort of thing. And looking, at the offense at right tackle, we have Carter Warren, which to me is, the gap where obviously the departure of, I'm trying to remember, the former Cowboy, I can't remember his name, but it's like you've got a hole to fill here and that sort of thing. I'm going to draft Ozzy Trapilo because he's going to be much needed. And it's like, while Fields is he's known for his elusiveness and his, crazy getaway ability, and his legs. You don't want to have to rely on that. And it's like, certain things like that put your QB at risk and you want to tackle. So now looking at this, we've drafted a wide receiver, a tackle. It says defensive interior. We've drafted a linebacker because I do think it's a need. I think that, going into this, I think it would also be beneficial to bring in a safety. Andre Cisco, I think, still very young, still very good. But Tony Adams is very, 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 old at this point. So it's like, do you want, something here where, you're going to go for a safety and look at Sebastian, Castro, maybe only falling this point because of the overall kind of bad grade this last year. In 2023, crazy good grade, average here. And it's like, a guy like this, I guess a little bit older with, and that sort of thing, perhaps this is a guy who can go and he can play, and it's like, and he can rush, the passer and that sort of thing. He did have a tackling issue, but I honestly feel like Aaron Glenn can fix that. You kind of draft some of these guys that it's like, if they're missing something, that they need to add to their game in the later rounds and you think you can fix it, that's why you grab them. A guy like this, playing a lot in the slot gives you a versatile there. Maybe you can also replace DJ Reed with some proper coaching and that sort of thing. And I think that you go for a guy like this. So it's like, passer rating allowed was high, but, and this sort of thing. But it's like forced income. I mean, perhaps you go and you grab a guy like this, at this point to see if you can fix his tackling issue. Moving on to round 5 with how many picks remaining? We have 4 picks remaining. We've had 4 already. Looking here, We always see a lot of these. I do think that you need to look at edge for this team. Well, I think that Will McDonald is doing very, very good. You did lose what's his face that left the team, Hassan Reddick, who obviously an interesting and weird year last year. But it's like I'm kind of looking for Tyler Batty right here. Good win rate, good solid. Not as many sacks as you want, but good amount of hurries. Tall, big, experience, and has been kind of moving up in the draft board and that sort of thing. And I just think that like pass rush win rate of 13.5, perhaps you get a little bit more out of that, and it's a guy you can move around, and that sort of thing. The only gap he really didn't cover was a gap, but a guy you can move around, versatility. Not that the Lions did that a lot or that Aaron Glenn did that a lot, but it's like, let's draft a pass rusher because I think that they need that sort of thing. Now I'm going to look at some of these other players. I'm going to look at wide receiver because I think that they could draft a few wide receivers. This is another big body kind of guy and who has been moving up, boards, I guess. And it's like had, a decent amount of production, more, obviously only 2 years, but more each year. And it's like contested catch rate is pretty high. I like that. And it's like man coverage grade isn't great, I guess. But no drops is something I look at. This looks kind of insane. This is a guy to me that it's like is big, has, that potential. Grab Tesla and you can run Garrett Wilson in the slot or that sort of thing. Now looking to here, I am kind of thinking potentially defensive interior here as a need that they've had. Pass rush win rate from an interior that's 10% is not bad. Pass rush grade high. His run defense is not very good and just doesn't have the size for it. So I'm really not looking for Hemingway here. Perhaps moving down, maybe you could also look at a tight end. I think a tight end is something that they need on this team. I think that people did not look really, and I guess, Prieskorn here looks like another kind of guy who can win contested catches and is a bigger guy. I think that with a guy like Justin Fields, he's willing to kind of throw those contested balls that we saw last year. And I think that they could use a guy like this, to give them some other sort of dimension. I'm going to draft Prieskorn here. Now moving on to our last pick. We've drafted a couple wide receivers, linebacker, tackle, edge. Perhaps you're looking for kind of, an O-line, offensive tackle, inside O-line. We got a center, but you definitely don't need a center on this team. I think Tripman is your guy. Perhaps you are looking to guard. I think Elijah Vera Tucker's fine, but he gets hurt quite a bit. You look for a guy. He doesn't have good length, but this guy is kind of a bruiser, a bigger guy, and that's the kind of trend we've seen, and he had his best year at right guard. Now, could he move left guard? Definitely. And I think, you want to be able to run on each side. I'm going to have this guy be the last pick for the Jets. So looking at this, McMillan, an A+ grade, draft Landon Jackson, I guess you could have, but then it's like, to me, I think that you do need a linebacker. You need to bring a linebacker in and that sort of thing. I think that I just think that it's something that you really do need to, kind of kind of focus on, I guess, is that like, Demetrius Knight looks like he's gonna fall a bit, but he's gonna be the best, overall, at that grade or that sort of thing. But it's like, I think that with this draft, you address the wide receiver room, you get guys that it's like I do certain things very well, Tesla, here, and then McMillan being a bigger, taller guy. It's like you can really have that kind of, jump ball versatility, where these guys are going to be able to win because they're 6'4" and 6'5", and then you're still going to have to count for Garrett Wilson, and we drafted very quality, to me, tackle and even a guard in the last round that looks, like he would fit kind of the mold of this team to be able to contribute to the run game and that sort of thing, which was, somewhat abysmal last year. You think with Breece Hall and Braylon Allen, Breece Hall and then Braylon Allen, who, was definitely a hustler and a strong player. You should be able to get more production out of them, and that'll be important in order to not throw everything on Justin Fields. So tell me what you guys think in the comments, or leave a like and subscribe. I'd appreciate it a lot. Personally, I think that, we look at some of these teams and it's like they make these moves and it's like, for all we know, maybe the only pick I'm kind of unhappy with would maybe be Sebastian Castro, as it was kind of like he's the highest available, and overall, it's like maybe they don't look at, the safety position as much. But I do know that on the Lions, that it's like with Aaron Glenn, he did value, safeties. And it's like, they go out and get Cisco, and maybe that's their answer. But perhaps a guy like Castro can come in and be a versatile piece. You move around, and have, be a guy you can put in that slot and you can put in at safety and, disguise looks with, which is definitely important in today's game. But that'll be it for this video. And as always, go Pack Go.